When retired circus elephant Luma reached her trunk across the warped oak lid of an upright piano at 6:12 a.m. and struck 11 notes in a clean, measured sequence, lead caretaker Dan Brooks stopped breathing for a full second, because he had heard that pattern before in a place no one at Briar Glen Elephant Sanctuary ever wanted to revisit. The barn smelled of wet hay, mineral salt, and rain blowing through high vents. Red mud marked half-moon prints across the concrete from the early turnout. 2 keepers froze by the hose reel. One of them, Leo Martinez, still held a scoop of soaked beet pulp in mid-air, as if the motion had been paused by hand. Luma struck the notes once, then again after a 5-count interval, each touch controlled at the trunk tip, each interval steady enough to sound practiced, and Dan's stomach dropped as memory collided with sound. An archive clip from 2008, recorded by State Highway Patrol after a circus trailer rollover, where a rehearsal keyboard in the wrecked support truck was playing that exact cue through a damaged speaker while handlers shouted and metal groaned in the rain. He was 52, with 19 years in elephant rehabilitation, and he did not believe in dramatic coincidence. He believed in body mechanics, feed logs, hydration curves, resting posture, and all the little indicators that animals offered when humans bothered to watch. But there, in the grey morning light, with fog caught high in the rafters and Luma's broad head tilted toward the keys, as if listening for confirmation, he felt a deep, ancient kind of dread that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with pattern recognition. "Did anyone trigger the audio system?" he asked without turning, voice tight. Leo shook his head. "System's off, generators still in test mode." Maria Kent, the shift medic, whispered, "She's choosing those notes." Luma pressed the gate latch with the side of her trunk, released it, then returned to the keyboard and repeated the sequence a 3rd time. The other elephants in neighboring stalls shifted away from their shared barrier, ears half spread, low rumbles dropping into frequencies Dan felt through his boots, more than heard with his ears. By the time Luma stepped back from the piano and held still, forward weight loaded subtly over her shoulders, Dan had already gone pale enough that Maria reached for his elbow. He nodded once, shook her off gently, and pulled his phone from his chest pocket with fingers that refused to steady. Archive folder. Incident footage. March 2008. He scrubbed to the timestamp he never forgot. 11:47 p.m. and the old recording crackled to life. Rain, siren, a looping rehearsal tone from a bent keyboard, handlers yelling over each other. 11 notes, same intervals, same rising 5th on the 9th beat. He muted the phone, eyes fixed on Luma. "Keep distance," he said, quiet but sharp. "Nobody enters primary barn lane until we map this." Leo set down the scoop. Maria clipped a pulse oximeter to her belt and stepped backward without argument. Luma touched the gate again and gave a low exhale, long enough to fog the steel bars. Before the scene moved another inch, before Dan could explain why a retired circus cue had surfaced in a sanctuary barn 15 years later, the channel voice cut through exactly as it always did, warm and direct, holding suspense in place by design. Before you watch, remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss another touching story like this one. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Then the story snapped back to the beginning of that rain-heavy morning, to the part that looked routine until it did not. At 4:58 a.m., Dan had parked by the east service gate under a sky the color of steel wool and walked into the barn with his hood dripping onto his clipboard. Briar Glen sat on 43 acres of reclaimed pasture and pine, with 3 geriatric paddocks, 2 rehab lanes, and 1 enrichment barn where old equipment was repurposed into low-impact cognitive stations. Scent boxes, puzzle drums, hanging brush walls, and the upright piano nobody expected to matter. He had inherited that piano 3 winters earlier when a donor closed a rural music school. Most days it served as tactile enrichment only. Elephants nudged keys, leaned on chords, and moved on. No cue training, no food-linked rewards, no performance loops. The policy was explicit. At 5:11, he opened Luma's overnight chart. Female Asian elephant, 47 years old, 7,860 pounds at last weigh-in. Chronic right forefoot degeneration from old circus chain trauma, long-term managed with hydrotherapy, anti-inflammatory rotation, and voluntary target compliance. The numbers on the tablet were not catastrophic yet, but they were trending in a direction he did not like. Temperature up 0.9 degrees from baseline over 18 hours, hydration index slipping, urine concentration rising, feed intake 0 since previous afternoon. 36 hours without meaningful food. He logged observation 1 at 5:19. Refused soaked hay cube mash and banana mash. Observation 2 at 5:23. Forward-leaning stance with guarded right forefoot. Limited shift pattern. Silence between low rumbles. Dan had seen hunger strikes. He had seen stubbornness and boredom and social sulking. This looked different, more precise, more contained. Rain intensified by 5:40, drumming on corrugated roofing hard enough to flatten ordinary barn noise into one dense sheet of sound. Dan walked the lane and stopped at Luma's stall. She faced him, ears relaxed, eyes alert, trunk tip curled inward just above the straw. She was not shutting down. She was not dissociating. She was waiting. "Morning, old girl," he said quietly, and lifted the blue target disc from the pegboard. "Choice check." She touched the disc once, then withdrew and shifted off the right forefoot so fast that only someone who knew her gait would catch it. Dan did catch it. His heart sank. "Pain score maybe 6, he said into his recorder, possibly higher under load. Leo arrived with fresh water and watched her ignore the bucket. "Still no drink?" Dan asked. "Since midnight," Leo replied. "A few sips at 12:14, then nothing." By 6:03, the medical room lights were on, and Dan stood over an open chart while Maria entered vitals from a thermal scanner and Leo cross-checked behavior logs from the previous week. Fog had crept inside through the loading bay and clung to the ceiling beams. The barn looked like a documentary set, all diffuse light and hard edges. On the whiteboard, someone had already written Protocol 72 in red marker. Dan stared at the heading longer than he meant to. Protocol 72 was the sanctuary's strict observation rule for geriatric elephants. No sedation, and no invasive diagnostics unless collapse indicators were present, or 2 senior clinicians signed immediate risk concurrence. The policy existed for good reason. Older elephants could crash under anesthesia, especially with cardiac compromise. It had saved lives before. It had also delayed intervention in cases that later looked obvious in hindsight, and hindsight had never once reduced pain. "Do we call Dr. Rao now or after second pass?" Maria asked, rubbing rainwater from her forearms with a towel. Dan looked at the trend line again, then at the timestamp on the wall clock, 6:07. "Call now," he said. Not emergency tone, elevated concern. Leo hesitated. "If we trigger elevated concern under 72, we're locked to observation intervals. No procedural jump unless she drops." Dan knew. Everyone in the room knew. That was the trade-off built into the framework. Procedural caution against cardiac risk on one side and the chance of preventable suffering on the other. Non-trivial was a polite word for that kind of decision. At 6:10, Dan returned to the enrichment barn with a fresh log sheet and a pulse hammer clipped to his belt. Luma had moved from her stall to the piano corner, where condensation beaded along the warped wooden frame, and one middle key stuck a fraction of an inch low. Rain hissed through the side vents. The other elephants held back near the far divider, watching her. Dan took 2 steps forward, stopped at the painted safety line, and waited for her next signal. She lifted her trunk, hovered over the keys, and pressed down in that measured pattern at 6:12. Each note separated by a pause precise enough to feel intentional. After the 3rd repetition, Dan wrote exactly 6 words on the chart margin, with a hand that trembled despite years of practiced control. Not enrichment, possibly coded distress signal. Then he underlined the time twice, circled Protocol 72, and looked up at Luma as she touched the gate latch, and held his gaze, while the rain kept falling and the morning crew stood in absolute silence, realizing they might already be late. No one moved until Luma exhaled again, a long, subterranean rumble that vibrated the piano's loose back panel and sent a soft metallic buzz through the barn walls. Dan felt it in his sternum, then in his teeth, and that old training instinct, observe first, name later, snapped back into place. "Leo, lane camera 3 and 4, live feed to medical room," he said quietly. "Maria, prep hydration kit, but hold outside primary. No entry." His voice sounded calmer than he felt. He kept his eyes on Luma's front limbs, watching the minute transfer of weight from left forefoot to right and back again. Tiny compensations that said pain long before any dramatic collapse ever did. Luma lowered her trunk to the keys, but did not play. She rested the tip on the chipped ivory and stood there, listening to rain hammer the roof, while the other elephants stayed clustered at the far divider, as if the space around her had become electrically charged. At 6:13 a.m., Dan stepped to the side wall and tapped the intercom for the control alcove. "Control, this is Brooks in enrichment. I need a time-stamped audio capture from now onward and pull archival file tag Highway 11 rollover rehearsal tone, March 2008, for comparison." A static crackle. Then Nora Phelps, overnight dispatcher, answered with sleep still in her voice. "Copy. Streaming now. You're requesting legacy incident media on active floor?" Dan swallowed once. "Affirmative." There was a brief pause at the other end, the kind that came when staff sensed the request was unusual enough to become report language later. "Understood," Nora said. "Dr. Rao has been paged elevated concern. Estimated callback 7 minutes." Dan thanked her and clipped the radio back to his vest without taking his attention off Luma's feet. The right forefoot was held half a degree outward compared to baseline stance photographs. Most people would never see it. He could not look away from it. Luma reached for the gate latch again, not yanking, not testing force, just touching the steel with deliberate pressure, then returning to stillness. Dan had seen stereotypic pacing, barrier knocking and stress weaving in dozens of elephants over 2 decades. This was none of those. This was patterned. "She's checking sequence points," Maria whispered behind him, almost to herself. Dan nodded once. "Or asking for a sequence." He hated how speculative that sounded, yet the evidence in front of them was not random enough to dismiss. Leo hurried past with a tablet and set it on a feed crate near Dan's elbow. On screen, the split camera showed Luma from above and from the opposite corner. Trunk to keys, gate latch touch, pause, low rumble, stillness. Even through compressed audio, the rumble made the ceiling microphone clip red. "Decibels low, frequencies lower," Leo said. "I can run spectrum." Dan said, "Do it. Mark each rumble between note cycles." At 6:16, Luma played the 11 notes again, this time with a slightly longer gap between the 5th and 6th. Dan counted in his head without realizing he was doing it. 1, 2, 3, touch. 1, 2, touch. The same rising 5th on the 9th beat. The same resolved drop on the 11th. His hands went cold despite the humid barn air. He had watched the 2008 footage too many times during her intake years, searching for cues he could translate into trust work. In that grainy clip, handlers were shouting over hydraulic hiss, while a broken speaker looped rehearsal tones no one bothered to turn off because the trailer was on its side, and everyone was trying to pull equipment before rainwater reached the wiring. Luma had been inside that trailer, sedated and restrained, breathing hard against metal walls while the cue repeated into the night. Dan did not need imagination to understand memory could weld sound to terror. He needed proof before he could ask for any step beyond observation, and proof, under Protocol 72, always arrived slower than pain. His radio clicked. "Brooks Rao," came Dr. Imani Rao's voice, clear and clipped. "I'm reviewing your prelim notes. Give me direct condition update." Dan angled away from the lane so his words would stay precise. "Female Asian, 47, no meaningful feed 36 hours, no significant water since 0014. Temp trend plus 0.9 over 18. Guarding right forefoot with forward load. Repeating fixed 11-note keyboard sequence every few minutes, matched by ear to legacy Circus cue from transport incident. Low-frequency rumbles during gate touch interval. No collapse indicators yet." On the other end, papers shifted. "Any respiratory distress?" she asked. "Rate elevated but regular," Dan said. "No discharge, no visible edema elsewhere." Rao answered immediately. "Under 72, maintain observation and non-invasive monitoring. I'm 15 minutes out. Do not enter lane. Do not provoke movement tests. Keep her calm." Dan closed his eyes for half a second. Understood. He wanted to add, "We may be missing our window," but protocol language had no field for intuition, only metrics. By 6:20, rain had begun to seep under the loading bay threshold in a shallow red ribbon that curled around drain grates and carried bits of straw past Dan's boots. The barn lights flickered once, then stabilized on generator support. Luma shifted back from the piano and raised her trunk toward him. Not high, not trumpeting, just hovering at chest height with the tip opening and closing in small, controlled motions. Seeking scent, seeking response. Dan lifted his empty palms where she could see them. "I hear you," he said softly, the same phrase he used during target desensitization after her rescue years. Luma held there for 3 breaths, then lowered the trunk and tapped the first key only, a single flat note that hung in the wet air and died against the rain. Leo muttered, "She's editing it now." Dan almost said, "Don't anthropomorphize," but the correction died before it reached his mouth. Behavior was communication. Whether humans were comfortable with the grammar or not, Maria returned from the medical room carrying a laminated pain scale board and a thermal scanner cradle. "Scanner battery at 76, she said. "Secondary battery charging." Dan asked, "Can we get thermal from the line without stressing her?" Maria looked at Luma's stance, then at the floor distance markers. "From here we'll get coarse data only. Might still show heat asymmetry if it's significant." Dan gave a brief nod. "Do it on her terms. No sudden movement." Maria crouched by the painted line, lifted the scanner slowly and waited for Luma to orient. Luma watched the device, ears relaxed but motionless, then turned slightly, exposing the right side. The scanner beeped once as Maria captured the frame. She checked the display, frowned, took 2 more images. "Not clean enough," she whispered. "Possible hotspot near sole margin, but the angle is wrong." Dan asked, "Enough for a note?" "Enough for concern, not enough for intervention," Maria said, and that sentence landed like a locked door. At 6:24, Control patched audio comparison through the overhead speaker at low volume. Nora's voice came over intercom. "Running side by side, current capture left channel, archive right channel. Levels normalized. The barn filled with two thin strands of melody, 15 years apart and eerily aligned. Luma lifted her head sharply at the archive tone, then pivoted one step backward and placed almost all weight on her left forefoot, right foot barely touching the ground. Dan's throat tightened. That was no longer subtle guarding. That was active offloading. "Cut archive," he said. Nora killed it instantly. Luma stayed frozen for 3 seconds, then touched the gate latch twice in rapid succession and emitted a short, low rumble, unlike the long pulses before. Leo looked at Dan, eyes wide. "She reacted to the old channel, not ours." Dan answered, "Log that exactly. No adjectives." Leo typed with shaking fingers anyway. A service cart rattled up outside, and Sanctuary Director Evelyn Shaw stepped into the doorway, raincoat dark with water, hair pinned tight against the weather. She had run Briar Glen for 12 years and had written half the current safety framework herself. "Status," she said, voice controlled. Dan gave it to her in numbers and behavior points, then added, "I requested live archive comparison." Response was immediate and negative to archive channel. Evelyn watched Luma through the misted lane for a long moment, jaw set. "You're asking where this goes," she said. Dan held her gaze. "I'm asking us not to wait for collapse as the only language we accept." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "Protocol 72 exists because we buried 2 geriatric elephants in 1 year after anesthesia events before these rules. You know that." Dan did know. He had stood in the rain for both burials. "I know," he said. "I also know she's telling us something with precision." Evelyn nodded once, the smallest concession. "Rao decides medical threshold. You keep data clean." At 6:31, Dr. Rao arrived in navy scrubs, under a rain shell, stethoscope clipped to her collar, tablet already open with Luma's baseline vitals, and long-term foot maps. She was 41, board-certified in large mammal medicine, and had the rare habit of listening fully before she spoke. Dan briefed while walking her along the outer lane. Rao stopped at the safety line and watched one full cycle without comment. Trunk to keys, 11 notes, gate touch, low rumble, stillness. On the second cycle, she asked, "Interval?" Leo answered from his tablet. 17 minutes average overnight, but in the last 20 it shortened to 8 and then 5. Rao's eyes narrowed. Pattern acceleration. She crouched to view the right forefoot angle and murmured, "Guarding is now visible at distance." Dan waited. Rao straightened and said, "We stay non-invasive this minute, but concern is escalating. Get me full blood chemistry prep. If she offers trunk at the protected port, we draw voluntarily. No sedation, no entry." Dan felt a thin strand of relief and fear braided together. It was action, but it was still the narrow corridor Protocol 72 allowed. The protected sampling port sat halfway down the primary barrier, a reinforced panel with sliding sleeve designed for voluntary trunk presentation during routine checks. Luma had used it hundreds of times during trust-based training, though never under conditions this charged. Dan walked to the port slowly, hands visible, voice low. "Luma, blue circle," he said, holding up the worn blue target disc from earlier. She looked from him to the disc and back, then took 2 careful steps forward, each right foot placement brief and guarded. That brief contact told him pain had sharpened. She extended her trunk through the sleeve and held it steady. Dan could smell wet earth and hay on her skin, and beneath it, the faint medicinal residue of last week's topical treatment. Maria swabbed gently, murmuring, "Good girl, steady," while Rao drew a dark line of blood into the first tube, then a second. Luma remained still until the final tube clicked free, then withdrew and immediately tapped the gate latch 3 times before returning to the piano. At 6:39, as Maria labelled specimens and Leo logged collection times to the second, Luma played only the first 4 notes, stopped, and pressed her trunk against the piano's wood frame as if bracing. Dan felt his pulse climb. "She's truncating," he said. Rao asked, "Pain response during sequence?" Dan nodded. "Looks like it." Rao replied, "Or respiratory fatigue or attentional shift. We test, we don't assume." It was exactly why Dan respected her, and exactly why the waiting hurt. Outside, thunder rolled low over the pine line, and the barn lights dipped again before the generator corrected. The atmosphere tightened with each mechanical flicker, each clipped breath from the crew, each small sign that Luma's body was narrowing its options. Concern was no longer a feeling in the room, it was an operational state. 3 minutes later, Nora called over intercom. "Lab runner delayed by flooded South Drive. Earliest pickup 28 minutes. Dan stared at the rainwater snaking past the drain and said, "Negative. We hand carry to Clinic Annex." Evelyn answered before Nora could. "Road closure at the culvert. No vehicle access." Dan almost argued, then caught himself and pivoted. "Then foot courier through North Catwalk. Covered route." Evelyn nodded. "Approved. Leo goes with Maria." Leo already had the insulated specimen case in his hands. Rao checked tube seals, then looked at Dan. "While they run this, I need continuous behavior capture. Exact timestamps. If there's a threshold change, I need it documented cleanly enough to justify override if necessary." Dan heard the key phrase and held on to it. If necessary. At 6:47, Maria and Leo disappeared into rain with the case zipped under Maria's jacket, and Dan remained at the barrier with Rao and Evelyn, watching Luma in the wavering light as she stood beside the piano, trunk resting lightly on the cracked keys, right forefoot lifted just enough to keep pressure off the sole. She did not play again for nearly 2 minutes. She simply looked at Dan, then at the gate, then back at Dan, as if asking the same question in a language everyone in that barn was still learning how to deserve. Dan held her gaze and felt the question land with more force than any alarm tone the sanctuary owned, because in 19 years he had learned that distress rarely arrived as chaos first. It arrived as pattern, and then as silence, and then as the look an animal gave you when it had run out of easier ways to ask. He stepped closer to the painted line, slow enough that Luma could track every movement, and raised the blue target disc to shoulder height. "Choice check," he said quietly. "Only if you want it." Luma reached forward, touched the disc with the soft underside of her trunk tip, then rested that same trunk on the keybed without pressing down. Dan watched the skin around her right eye tighten, one small crease above old depigmented speckles, and memory pulled him backward with painful clarity. Intake day in 2014. Chain scars circled deep around both forefeet, body score low, startle response severe to metallic clatter, and that same right eye watching every hand in the room as if hands were always followed by restraint. Dr. Rao stayed beside him, still, letting the moment breathe. "She's orienting to you more than the object," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off Luma. Dan nodded. "She did that during Hydra introductions. If she thought we were tricking her, she'd disengage and face the wall." Evelyn folded her wet raincoat over one arm and asked, "Do we have footage from first-year trust sessions?" Leo's voice came from the doorway as he shook water from his sleeves, Maria at his shoulder with the empty specimen case. "Archive server has it. I can pull by behavior tag," Dan answered without looking away from Luma. "Tag for gate touch and low rumble pairs. Also anything marked post-thunder episodes." Luma lifted her trunk from the keys and set it briefly against the gate latch, then touched the blue disc again, gentle and exact. not random, not frantic. She was still trying to keep them with her. At 6:55 a.m., Maria returned to the barrier and held up a dry towel, offering it through the visual field where Luma could see, but not be startled. "You did great on the draw," she said softly, the same tone she used for wound rinses and weight checks. Luma shifted her weight left, right forefoot hovering just above concrete, then lowered it for less than a second and lifted again. Dan's chest tightened. That quick set down looked like fire under the sole. He crouched near the line and lowered his voice until it was almost a murmur. "No one's moving you, no darts, no trailer. You're here." The words were for her and for him both. Leo glanced up from his tablet. "Dan, I pulled old transport conditioning notes from her intake file. They redacted the Circus brand, but there's mention of an 11-tone assembly cue used before loading drills." Dan closed his eyes for half a breath. "Read the rest," Leo swallowed, followed by restraint prep and compartment lock checks. No one spoke for a moment. Rain pressed against the roof in hard, even sheets. By 7:08, the clinic annex had run a rapid panel on the blood draw, and Maria read the numbers off her phone with clinical precision that did not hide the strain in her voice. Inflammatory markers elevated from last week. Creatinine up from baseline by 0.4. Packed cell volume concentrated. She's drying out. "Doctor." Rao took the phone, scanned, and gave the verdict in a tone that carried across concrete like a gavel. "This is early renal stress risk if intake does not improve." Dan asked, "Timeline?" Rao answered, "If this trend holds and she still won't drink, we may have 14 hours before risk becomes acute. Could be less if pain escalates movement avoidance." The math landed hard. 14 hours sounded long until he counted how slowly large animal decisions moved under wet weather constraints, staffing limits, and the policy written in red on the whiteboard. Luma played the first 3 notes of the sequence, stopped, and exhaled a low rumble that made the loose bolts in the piano frame tremble. At 7:19, thunder rolled directly overhead, and Luma responded with a full 11-note run, faster than before, then touched the gate latch twice and held still, ears angled outward. The elephants in the adjacent lane backed 3 paces from the barrier as one group. Dan watched their feet and felt dread gather with procedural clarity. Not panic, because herd spacing shifts like that meant they were reading her state and giving room. "Frequency increase," he said. Leo checked timestamps. Cycle dropped to 6 minutes 30. Dr. Rao asked for a second thermal set from the line. Maria knelt again, scanner steady in both hands. This time Luma angled herself, almost cooperative, and the display resolved enough to show it. A concentrated heat bloom at the right forefoot sole margin, deeper and brighter than surrounding tissue. Rao looked at the image and said, "Localized inflammatory source likely, could be abscess, could be retained fragment, could be both." Dan asked, "Can we lance if she presents?" Rao shook her head. "Not through barrier, not blind, not with this depth uncertainty." At 7:43, Dan tried water again with every low-stress option they had. He offered a warmed bucket. No response. He set out soaked hay cubes near her preferred corner. She sniffed and withdrew. He asked for diluted electrolyte mash in a shallow tub. Luma touched the rim, then returned to the piano and pressed one key over and over, a dull middle note, 5 times in measured intervals. Dan felt his pulse in his temples. "She's narrowing behavior to signal points," he said. Evelyn stood with arms folded, face set. "Or she's perseverating under pain." Dan turned to her, respectful but raw. "Those aren't separate in this case." She held his look, then nodded once. "Keep recording. Clean data is how we protect her and change policy if we need to." That was as close to agreement as he would get right now, and it had to be enough. 3 days earlier, he had joked with Leo about Luma's habit of nudging broom handles into tidy lines, as if she were managing their housekeeping standards. At 8:05 that morning, standing in a barn that smelled like wet wood and antiseptic, Dan remembered that tiny joke and felt ashamed for how easily humans treated precision as personality until precision became inconvenient. Leo broke the silence with a quiet update. I found digitized circus training ledgers from a legal discovery archive. One entry references Q11, hold, load, lock. Data lines with the rollover week. Dr. Rao extended her hand. Send to me and Evelyn now. If that cue is trauma-linked, interpretation of current behavior changes clinical urgency. Leo forwarded the file and muttered, sending with source chain. Dan watched Luma set her trunk on the keys without pressing and whispered, "You've been saying this for years, haven't you?" Her eye stayed on him, unblinking, while rainwater tracked in thin red streams toward the floor drains. At 8:22, the dread became arithmetic. Rao laid it out for the team in a low voice near the medcart, while Dan kept line of sight on Luma. Aging elephant, rising inflammatory burden, decreasing intake, guarded limb indicating severe pain under load. We can continue observation and hope she self-corrects, or we can prepare for emergency override if threshold criteria are met. Maria asked, "What threshold are we waiting for exactly?" Rao answered, "Under 72, collapse markers, or 2 senior concurrents of imminent life-threatening progression with documented evidence that delay increases harm." Dan heard every word and hated the narrowness of the corridor. He had buried elephants who never technically collapsed until they did, too fast to recover. Luma played the full sequence again, then touched the gate and lifted her right forefoot for 1 suspended second before setting it down with visible care. Dan recorded the timestamp and wrote in the margin, "Voluntary limb display during distress pattern." By 9:20, the rain had eased to a steady hiss, but nothing in the barn felt lighter. Leo projected side-by-side audio spectrograms on the medical room monitor. Current keyboard pattern on one side, 2008 archived cue on the other. Near identical interval spacing when normalized for tempo. "Variance under 3%, Leo said, voice tight with disbelief. Evelyn leaned in. "Could random enrichment reproduce that?" Leo shook his head. "Possible in theory, but repeated alignment over this many cycles is statistically very low." Dan stood at the doorway, muddy boots leaving crescents on concrete, and felt the dread sharpen into urgency that had nowhere to go. He keyed his radio. "Control, log this as formal evidence packet for clinical review and policy exception consideration." Nora answered immediately, now fully alert. "Logged at 09:22. Packet tagged to Protocol 72 deliberation. External contact made. Outcome recorded." He returned to the barrier and found Luma waiting in the same stance. 1 foot protected, trunk resting on chipped ivory like a hand on a locked door. At 9:47, he asked the question anyway, because not asking felt like betrayal. "Can I go in?" The words came out steady. Evelyn answered first. "No." Rao added, gentler but firm, "Not without sedation protocol in place and full team positioning. 1 slip and we risk both of you." Dan kept his eyes on Luma. "She presents better with me in lane." Rao said, "I know, but policy is written around worst-case dynamics, not best-case bonds." Frustration rose in him like heat, controlled but fierce. Then policy is treating her communication as optional. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Policy is preventing another anesthesia death. Dan turned to face her fully now. "And delay can become harm. We are watching that happen in real time." No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The tension was procedural, moral, and exhausting. At 10:06, Maria handed Dan a fresh log sheet because his first was full edge-to-edge with timestamps and tight handwriting. He took it, noticed his fingers trembling, and pressed the clipboard against the rail until the tremor settled. Luma played 7 notes, stopped, touched the gate latch, and rumbled low. Dan mirrored the rhythm on the rail with 2 fingertips, an old grounding trick from his own first years in rescue work. "You're not a performance file," he whispered. "You're a patient." Leo approached with another tablet, cheeks flushed from moving between rooms. "I found one more ledger annotation. It's ugly." Dan looked at him. Leo read directly. Q11 repeated if subject resists, ramp approach. Then notation, apply second tranquilizer if non-compliant. Maria shut her eyes briefly. Rowe exhaled and said, "That reframes this entire behavior set." Evelyn asked, "Can we validate document authenticity?" Leo nodded. Court-stamped scans, source metadata intact. By 10:47, frustration had become a wall everyone could see. Luma had refused all feed offerings for another cycle and still had not taken meaningful water. Her right forefoot now stayed lifted for longer stretches, and each set down looked deliberate, careful, costly. Dan stood at the barrier with rain-damp shirt clinging to his back and felt helplessness scrape at every professional reflex he owned. Do less harm, move quickly, follow policy, believe behavior. The principles collided and none would yield. He turned to Dr. Rao, voice rough but controlled. "I'm filing formal challenge. Protocol 72 is no longer neutral here. It is delaying response to a documented distress signal linked to trauma and active physical decline." Evelyn started to speak, stopped, then said, "If you file, it triggers director-level review and legal notation." Dan answered, "Then log it, timestamp it. I'd rather defend action than explain why we waited." Rao looked from Dan to Luma and back again, weighing risk with the grim clarity of someone who had signed both saves and losses in equal ink. "Submit the challenge," she said quietly. "I will attach medical concurrence for urgent reassessment, not yet full override. We need one more objective indicator to cross threshold cleanly." Dan nodded once, already writing the formal language on the second log sheet, each word deliberate so no one could dismiss it as panic later. In the lane, Luma lifted her right forefoot and held it toward him for a long, trembling second, then lowered it and pressed a single key that rang through the barn like a bell struck in fog. The note hung for a beat, then dissolved into rain noise and generator hum, and Dan finished the line on the form with block letters that left grooves in the paper. Formal challenge filed by lead caretaker Daniel Brooks at 10:47 a.m. Administrative processing logged at 10:48 a.m. Protocol 72 urgent reassessment requested. He signed, passed the clipboard to Evelyn, and kept one hand on the barrier rail so Luma could see him stay in place. She stood with her right forefoot lifted again, trunk resting against the edge of the keybed, not pressing, just holding contact with the wood as if it were a marker in a map only she remembered. Evelyn read the form once, then a second time more slowly. Water from her raincoat cuff dotted the ink. "This triggers legal notation and outside review," she said, quieter now, as if the barn itself required lower volume. Dan nodded. "Then let it trigger." "Doctor." Rao took the clipboard, added her signature under medical concurrence for urgent reassessment, and handed it back. "Leo, transmit the packet to oversight now. Include spectrogram alignment, thermal stills, chemistry trend, and the Circus ledger documents with source chain." Leo was already typing, thumbs shaking but precise. Sending at 10:50, he said. Priority medical. Luma turned her head toward the intercom speaker when the transmission chime sounded from the control alcove. She did not play the full sequence. She pressed 2 notes, paused, then tapped the gate latch with the side of her trunk and gave a low rumble that ran through the steel posts. Dan watched that pattern and felt a thin thread of hope appear inside the dread, because she was still engaging, still selecting, still showing them where to look. Animals in terminal shutdown withdrew from choice. Luma was asking questions with every movement. At 10:54, Nora's voice came over the speaker, clipped and fully awake now. Oversight acknowledged receipt. Director-level teleconference opening in 6 minutes. Off-site senior clinician joining from North Valley Zoo Hospital. External contact resolved, Dan thought automatically, the way he tracked all open loops under pressure, but then Luma shifted and almost set her right forefoot down fully before yanking it back into hover. The motion was quick enough to make him flinch. Maria whispered, "That was a pain spike." Dr. Rao answered, "Log it with exact time." They assembled in the medical room doorway where Luma remained in direct line of sight. The monitor showed split feeds: lane camera, thermal stills, audiographs, live vitals from non-contact sensors. At 11 o'clock on the wall clock, the call connected. A man in blue scrubs appeared on screen, name tag visible in the corner feed. Dr. Elias Mercer, Senior Large Mammal Clinician, 23 years field anesthesia experience. His voice came through a half-second delayed channel. "I have your packet. Give me the shortest, truthful version." Rao delivered it without embellishment. 47-year-old Asian female, chronic right forefoot pathology, acute pain behaviors escalating since dawn, intake refusal 36+ hours, dehydration trend, inflammatory markers elevated, creatinine rising, distress signal pattern linked to documented historical loading queue associated with restraint and tranquilization. Protocol 72 currently limits invasive diagnostics, absent collapse, or imminent threat concurrence. Mercer listened with his hand at his mouth, eyes moving across data panes. "Any collapse signs now?" he asked. "No collapse," Rao said. "But behavior frequency acceleration, limb offloading, and hydration decline suggest we are moving toward critical risk." Evelyn stepped in then, her tone controlled but stripped of defensiveness. "The policy was written after anesthesia losses. We are not ignoring pain. We are balancing against cardiac hazard in a geriatric patient." Mercer nodded. "Understood. Question is whether delay now adds more risk than intervention." He looked down to read the ledger excerpt Leo had highlighted. "Q11. Hold. Load. Lock," he read aloud, then glanced at the spectrogram comparison. "And she is reproducing that structure repeatedly under active pain signs." He looked back into camera. "That changes interpretation. This is not neutral enrichment behavior." The room stayed silent for a second that felt longer than it was. Luma pressed one key in the lane and the sound carried in through the open door, thin and flat. Mercer said, "I can support conditional override with safeguards. No full anesthesia until we capture high-resolution thermal and mechanical load data. Then decide on sedation depth. You need one dynamic indicator from live behavior that localizes source beyond chronic baseline." Dan leaned toward the monitor. "She has been offering the right forefoot intermittently during the sequence." Mercer looked straight into camera. "Then structure a controlled elicitation and capture it cleanly. If she presents voluntarily and imaging confirms acute focal heat with swelling, threshold is met." At 11:07, the call ended with provisional authorization pending that indicator, and Dan felt that fragile hope strengthen into something he could work with. Not relief, but a path. Dr. Rao moved immediately. "Maria, bring the portable thermal rig from clinic storage, not the handheld. I need continuous video overlay with temperature mapping. Leo set up synchronized timestamps across all feeds. Nora, patch audio into the analysis channel. Evelyn, I need emergency medication tray staged but sealed until threshold confirmation. Evelyn answered without hesitation. Approved. By 11:20, the rain had eased to a fine mist that coated the loading bay in red sheen, and two staff from the annex rolled in the thermal cart, its screen wrapped in clear plastic, battery module humming. The cart looked oversized in the narrow lane, all aluminum frame and articulated arm, but it gave them what they had lacked all morning: depth, sensitive imaging at enough fidelity to separate scar warmth from active infection. Dan stayed at the barrier while cables were taped down and safety checks called out one by one. Luma watched every movement and remained still. Trunk tip curled inward, right forefoot suspended. Battery 93%. Sync clock 11:24:18. Camera overlay aligned. Emergency reversal meds present and sealed. Procedural language settled people when fear climbed. Dan knew that. He also knew Luma read rhythm, and the room had shifted from helplessness to coordinated intent. She lowered her trunk, touched the gate latch once, then turned her head toward him. He lifted the blue target disc. "Choice check," he said softly. "Only if you want." She reached and touched the disc with deliberate gentleness. Maria exhaled through her nose, almost a laugh, almost a cry. "She's still with us," she whispered. 3 minutes later, Dan tried water again with a shallow pan infused the way Luma preferred in cold weather, a trace of apple and warm mineral mix. He placed it near her lane-side corner and stepped back. Luma approached on careful placements, left forefoot steady, right forefoot brief, and guarded. She dipped her trunk, lifted, and let most of it spill. Then she dipped again and took a small swallow. Just one, then a second. The numbers did not reverse from 2 swallows, but hope in a medical barn was often that small, and still mattered. Intake resumed, minimal but present. 11:29, Leo said, logging it fast. By late morning, the Oversight Office returned written authorization on a 1-page addendum that Evelyn read aloud to the team so no one misunderstood scope. Conditional Emergency Diagnostic Override approved under Protocol 72 subsection C, contingent on live dynamic localization of acute pathology and senior clinician concurrence. She lowered the page. "Once localization is captured, we move." Dan looked at the clock, then at Luma's lifted foot, then back to Dr. Rao. "How soon can we run the elicitation?" Rao checked the cart calibration and answered, "As soon as she offers us the opening." At 12:04, clouds broke enough to throw a pale rectangle of light across the barn floor, and for the first time all day the rafters looked less like a closed lid. Dan did not trust symbolism, but he noticed how everyone breathed a little deeper when the light changed. Luma played 5 notes, paused, touched the gate, and rumbled low. Then she stopped and looked at him in that fixed, waiting way that had followed him through every hard case of his career. He understood the sequence now as request, warning, memory, and present pain layered together. He also understood how close they still were to failing her if they hesitated wrong for even one cycle. At 12:37, Dr. Rao called for final positioning. Dan at barrier center behind rails, Maria on thermal control, Leo on timestamp and behavior log, Evelyn on medication verification. No one crosses primary lane. If she presents, we do not rush. Dan took his place and wrapped both hands around the cold rail. The thermal screen flickered into live color map, concrete in muted blue, metal bars in green, Luma's body in gradients of amber and red. Her right forefoot already glowed warmer than the left by a visible margin, But they still needed dynamic confirmation under voluntary movement to satisfy the clause that would defeat the policy barrier. Minutes stretched. Luma stood with trunk resting on the piano frame, then lifted it and hovered over the keys without pressing. The barn quieted to rain drip, distant fan motors, and the subtle click of Leo's keyboard as he marked every posture shift. Dan felt the old guilt rise. The years where he had praised her musical mood when she tapped patterns, the mornings he had treated repetition as personality instead of a possible distress lexicon. He did not let the guilt take over. He let it sharpen attention. "I'm here," he said, barely above breath. "Show us." At 1:18 p.m., after one last look at the live feed and the signed addendum clipped to her board, Dr. Rao gave the order they had been working toward all morning. "Conditional diagnostic elicitation phase is authorized under the addendum," she said. "Emergency override activation remains contingent on confirmed live localization. Begin controlled elicitation." Fragile hope turned from feeling into action. Dan unlocked his tablet and opened the sanitized tone file Leo had built from the morning recordings, volume set low enough to avoid startling. He positioned the speaker against the rail, outside the lane, and played the 11 notes once, slow and clear. Luma's ears angled forward. She stepped toward him, one deliberate placement at a time. Each right foot contact brief, then lifted. The thermal screen pulsed with every motion. Maria whispered, "Capture running." No one spoke after that. The suspense in the barn became physical, a pressure in the chest, as if everyone was holding a shared breath and could not release it until Luma chose her next move. Dan replayed the phrase, softer this time. Luma halted 2 meters from the barrier, trunk suspended mid-air, eyes fixed on him. For 3 long seconds she did nothing. Then she touched the gate latch once. Not forceful. Exact. "Timestamp 13/1942, Leo whispered. Dan lowered the tablet. "Luma," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Can you show me?" He lifted his open palm to chest height, the same cue position from years of target training, then waited. Luma shifted her weight left and lifted her right forefoot toward him, not high, just enough to expose the sole edge to the camera arm. She held it. Maria's fingers flew across the thermal controls, locking focus. The screen flared with a concentrated bloom near the subsolar margin, brighter than any surrounding tissue, a tight white-yellow hotspot inside deeper reds. Dan heard someone behind him inhale sharply. Luma lowered the foot with care, touched the first piano key with her trunk, and lifted the foot again. "Second presentation 13/20/11, Leo said, voice cracking. The hotspot remained in the same location, now clearer with angle correction. Swelling contour appeared along the sole line, subtle but unmistakable when overlaid against baseline maps. Dr. Rao stepped closer to the monitor, one hand braced on the cart. "Hold that frame," she said. "Compare to chronic scar map." Maria split the screen. Old scar heat spread diffuse and broad. This was focal, intense, and deep. Dan could hear his own heartbeat. He kept his posture open, eyes on Luma, willing his body to project calm she could trust. "Good," he murmured. "You're doing good." Luma lowered the foot, breathed out in a low rumble that vibrated the rails, then lifted the right forefoot a third time, higher than before, exposing the sole margin fully for 2 full seconds. "Third presentation, 13/20/37, Leo said. On the monitor, the bloom sharpened into a defined core with radiating heat halo and soft tissue swelling around it. Dr. Rao did not look away. "Dynamic localization confirmed," she said, each word clipped and clear. "Acute focal pathology right forefoot, consistent with deep subsolar abscess, possible foreign body involvement. Threshold met. Conditional criteria satisfied. Emergency diagnostic override is now active. She turned to Evelyn. Activate sedation protocol tier 1 and prep for controlled drainage setup. We move now. Evelyn broke the seal on the medication tray with hands that were steady for the first time all day. Sedation team to positions, she called toward the medroom door. Maria switched the thermal recording to secure save and read out file numbers, so chain of custody stayed intact. Thermal sequence archived, 3 voluntary lifts captured, overlay exported to patient record and policy review packet. Dan stayed at the rail while the team moved around him in practiced arcs, and Luma lowered her foot, touched the gate latch once more, then rested her trunk on the piano keys without pressing any sound at all. The silence after the notes felt heavier than the music had. He met her gaze and gave a single nod, an answer at last to the question she had been asking since dawn. This time, everyone had heard her. Sedation runners crossed the lane in a practiced arc, rubber soles whispering on wet concrete, while Dan stayed where he was, at the rail, and kept his hands visible to Luma, palms open, blue target disc lowered against his thigh so it wouldn't read as a new demand. Dr. Rao moved to his shoulder, voice low and even. Tier 1 standing sedation, reversible window, no deep drop unless she destabilizes. You keep her engaged. If she gives us trunk at port, we can avoid a dart. Dan nodded once. Luma, he said softly. Blue circle if you're ready. She lifted her trunk from the silent keys, touched the disc with precise pressure, and held there long enough for Maria to slide the protected sleeve into position. Even under escalating pain, even with every reason not to trust another procedure, she chose the cooperative path she had built with them over 9 years. The room went very quiet around that fact. Maria primed the pole syringe with a dose calculated to the kilogram, read it aloud, and waited for Dr. Rao's confirmation. Dose verified, Rao said. Route verified, time 0 at administration. Dan kept his voice on the same calm line he had used for blood draws, and hydro sessions and hard nights when thunder sent old memories through the herd. Steady, old girl. We're not moving you anywhere. Luma extended her trunk through the sleeve, then retracted and shifted, giving them her left shoulder at the barrier window. Maria placed the injector, depressed, withdrew in one smooth motion, and Leo logged the timestamp to the second. 13, 22, 14. No one cheered. No one spoke louder than necessary. The awe in the barn sat under everyone's ribs as procedural discipline. Within 2 minutes, Luma's breathing deepened and slowed. Her eyelids softened but stayed responsive. She tested the piano with one light touch that produced a muted tone, then lifted her right forefoot and set it down with care. Dan watched for any sign of panic association with the medication phase, the old loading memory that had once followed tranquilizer darts and steel ramps. Instead, she leaned her trunk against the gate and exhaled one low rumble that vibrated the bar beneath his hands. Neither alarm nor shutdown, more like acknowledgement. Doctor. Rao checked pupillary response and ear perfusion from the line and gave the next order. Sedation is at cooperative depth. Team entry in pairs, no sudden angles. Maintain verbal continuity. Evelyn keyed the lane lock. Hydraulic bolts clunked. The primary gate opened 20 inches, then 30, and Dan's pulse climbed hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. By 1:27 p.m., Dan stepped inside the lane for the first time that day, boots passing the painted line that had held him back for hours. Red mud tracked in crescents under his soles. He stopped at the pre-marked position beside the barrier rail, close enough for Luma to scent him clearly, far enough to leave Dr. Rao a direct working corridor to the right forefoot. "You did exactly right," he murmured, and Luma turned her head toward him, eye half-lidded but focused. Maria and a second vet tech slid a thick rubber mat under the 4-foot zone to reduce slip risk. Leo kept narrating logistics into the recorder. Entry sequence stable, patient standing, no agitation. Right 4-foot intermittently unloaded. Even with sedation on board, the foot avoided full pressure. That detail stayed unchanged. Dr. Rao crouched, gloved hands moving with controlled patience along the sole margin and nail line, palpating without force, pausing each time Luma shifted. Heat is concentrated medially and subsolar, she said, swelling contour present. I need image confirmation before we open. Maria rolled the portable digital radiography plate forward and angled it under the foot with a long-handled guide. Dan braced one hand on the rail and kept speaking in the same rhythm, less language than anchor. Here with you, you're here. Barn, rain, us. Luma's trunk tip drifted toward his sleeve, touched once, and returned to rest against the piano frame. That tiny contact nearly broke him. He held steady anyway. First radiograph at 13:31 came back blurred by micro-movement. Rao asked for a repeat with different angle and less compression. Second image resolved enough to show dense, soft tissue shadowing, but no clear boundary. One more, she said. Sharper now, the urgency finally visible. Oblique, 30 degrees. Maria adjusted. Leo called the time. Dan watched Luma lift her right 4-foot half an inch and hold it on command without anyone touching her. The machine emitted its short electronic click. They stepped back. For a few breaths there was only rain ticking off the roof and the low fan noise from the thermal cart while the image processed. When the third radiograph appeared on the monitor, the barn seemed to stop moving. A narrow linear object sat just inside the inflamed tract near old scar tissue, high density and unmistakably metallic, approximately 4 centimeters long, with one end angled like a sheared pin, Maria whispered. No. Leo stared at the screen, then at the archived hardware diagram he had pulled from the legal file and left open in a side window. Dr. Rao, he said, voice thinning, look at the transport crate latch assembly from the 2008 records. The retaining pin dimensions are close to this. Rao stepped in, compared overlays, and gave the clinical verdict that turned speculation into fact. Foreign body confirmed. Migrating metal fragment with deep abscess formation. This is acute, not baseline degeneration. Dan felt the shock travel through him in 2 waves. First, the simple physical recognition that every step she had taken was driving metal through inflamed tissue. Then the moral force of the pattern she had used to tell them. The 11 notes. Gate touch, foot lift, repeat. Not a trick. Not random enrichment, not stubbornness. A structured distress signal built from the worst cue in her memory and aimed at the only humans in front of her now. He pressed his hand flat on the rail to stop the tremor and looked at her eye, dark and steady in the barn light. You were spelling it out, he said, barely audible. Dr. Rao didn't look away from the image. We proceed to controlled drainage and extraction now. Keep her standing if possible. Transition to deeper plane only if she destabilizes. She turned to Evelyn. Override is justified and active. Document this as protocol-defining evidence. Evelyn nodded, face pale but composed, and keyed the decision into the incident log at 13:36. External review box checked. Threshold rationale attached. No ambiguity left for hindsight to weaponize later. Maria handed Rao the sterile tray. Instruments clinked softly, a restrained metallic chorus that made Dan's shoulders tighten until Luma touched his sleeve again and exhaled a low, warm breath across his wrist. The procedure itself was careful, methodical, and faster than the morning of waiting had prepared any of them for. Rao cleaned the sole margin, identified the softest point over the heat bloom, and made a small opening to release pressure. Luma flinched once, then settled at Dan's voice. Steady, almost there. Relief from decompression was visible within seconds in the way she stopped snatching the foot away. Rao followed the tract with a slim probe, found resistance, changed angle, and asked for long forceps. "I have it," she said quietly. Everyone froze in place, listening to rain and breathing and the minute sounds of gloved precision. At 1:41 p.m., she drew out the fragment in one continuous motion. It was dark silver, worn at the edges, bent slightly through the middle, and long enough that Maria's breath caught in her throat. Rao held it up only long enough for Leo to photograph with scale marker and timestamp, then dropped it into a sterile evidence jar with a hard glass click that echoed across concrete. Dan stared at the jar as if the object might argue with him. It did not need to. Its shape already matched the hardware diagram on Leo's screen with unnerving closeness. Leo swallowed and said what everyone was thinking. Hold, load, lock. No one answered him. The line had become unbearable in its clarity. Luma lowered her foot, tested weight, then shifted back, and tested again. Not full load yet, but more than she had tolerated all day. Dr. Rao began flushing the cavity, placed medicated packing, and called for IV line placement and fluid bolus. Maria moved to the ear vein with practiced gentleness. Dan kept contact through voice. No touch unless invited, because trust had always been built there first. "You did it," he whispered. "You got us there." Luma's trunk drifted to the piano keys and pressed one note, then another, then stopped after two. The 11-note sequence did not return. 3 days earlier, that silence would have looked like nothing. In that moment, it landed like a revelation so stark that even the most protocol-minded staff in the room looked stunned. The pattern had not been compulsive entertainment behavior. It had been contingency language under pain, deployed repeatedly until humans aligned with it. Rao finished securing the dressing and stepped back, eyes bright with controlled emotion she rarely let surface in front of teams. "Record this interpretation precisely," she said to Leo. "Condition transport cue repurposed as distress communication during acute pathology. Behavioral signal resolved after source relief began." Leo typed with both hands, blinking hard. Logged. By 1:49 p.m., IV fluids were running, sedation remained stable, and the thermal cart showed the hotspot beginning to diffuse at the margins. Not healed, not safe yet, but no longer an unchecked fire. Evelyn moved to Dan's side, keeping her gaze on Luma. "You were right to challenge," she said quietly. Dan shook his head once. She was right. We were late. Evelyn accepted that without defense. "Then we fixed the part that made us late," she said, and keyed a follow-up note into the live file. Protocol 72. Revision review mandatory. Distress signal criteria to be added. Rao capped the evidence jar, labelled it, and handed it to Maria for chain of custody transfer to the clinic safe and later materials analysis. Physical evidence resolved into documented custody. Not rumour, not memory. Leo sent the radiographs, thermal overlays, procedure photos, and extraction log to oversight and to Dr. Mercer's office, then read back confirmation receipts as they arrived one by one. Every external contact that had hovered over the morning now had an outcome attached, time-stamped and signed. Dan finally let himself place his fingertips on the rail instead of gripping it, and watched Luma stand with both forefeet down for a full 5 seconds before lifting the right again to rest. Progress measured in seconds still counted. The barn smelled of antiseptic, wet hay, and ozone from old wiring in damp weather. Outside, rain softened to a fine mist that made the paddock fences shine. Inside, no one spoke in dramatic language. They did not need it. Awe sat in the room as plain fact. Luma turned her head, looked directly at Dan, and rested her trunk across the silent piano keys without pressing a single note. He met her gaze and understood, with a force that would stay with him long after incident forms were archived and policy meetings ended. That memory had carried her signal all the way from a wrecked trailer in 2008 to this barn in the rain. And that being heard had begun not with a miracle, but with finally believing the message she had been giving all along. Dan did not step away when the evidence jar disappeared down the lane with Maria. He stayed at the rail until Dr. Rao finished the last wrap and checked capillary refill one more time because his body still expected another reversal, another sudden downturn, another reason this could not be real. Luma stood in the damp light, with her trunk draped over the piano lid and her right forefoot resting on the rubber mat, not hovering now, not jerking back, just resting. The shift was small enough to miss if you were looking for drama. Dan had spent 19 years learning to trust small shifts. His eyes burned before he realized he was crying. "Fluid line is holding," Maria said quietly when she returned, rain on her sleeves, empty hands now. Evidence jar logged into clinic safe at 13:53. Chain of custody signed by me and Nate at Annex Intake. Leo read from his tablet without looking up, voice shaky but precise. Photo set uploaded, radiographs uploaded, thermal overlays uploaded, extraction note signed by Rao. Doctor. Mercer acknowledged receipt at 13:55 and requested metallurgy and contamination panel. Dr. Rao stripped one glove, then the other, and finally let her breath out. "Tell him we're sending same-day courier when roads reopen. For now, secure storage remains primary." Every loop they had opened all morning clicked toward closure. Luma shifted again and placed more weight onto the treated foot, then rocked back, testing limits with the caution of an animal who had been punished by movement for too long. Dan moved one step closer and kept his voice where she liked it, low and unhurried. "That's it. You set the pace." She reached toward him, trunk tip grazing his forearm once, and a sound came out of him that was half laugh, half sob. Maria looked away and wiped her cheek with the back of her wrist. Even Evelyn, whose composure had carried the staff through every hard season, pressed two fingers under her glasses and said nothing for several seconds. By 2:11 p.m., sedation had lightened enough for Rao to begin reversal in measured increments. "No rush," she said, watching heart rate and respiration. "Comfort first, alertness second." Dan nodded and stayed in her line of sight while the team cleared instruments, sealed biohazard containers, and bagged used packing for disposal logs. Nothing was left loose. Nothing was left implied. The foreign body fragment sat in the clinic safe with a Tampa seal number in 3 separate records. The blood tubes from Dawn had already generated initial chemistry results and were now refrigerated for follow-up inflammatory and renal trend checks. The thermal files were mirrored to local and cloud backup. Every physical thread was held. When the first reversal dose took effect, Luma blinked hard, lifted her trunk, and tapped 2 keys with delicate precision. Not 11. 2. She paused, then turned away from the keyboard and reached for the warm water pan Dan had placed at lane center. She drank, slowly at first, then deeper, trunk drawing and pouring until Leo whispered, "Intake event 2.8 liters, 1419. Dan closed his hand around the cold rail to steady himself. 12 hours earlier, they had been counting down to kidney risk. Now, she was choosing water on her own. He leaned his forehead briefly against the metal and let the relief hit him without fighting it. At 14:32, Nora's voice came across the intercom with the final oversight callback. Administrative note: emergency override accepted as compliant under subsection C. No violation flags. Mandatory debrief scheduled 1800 with director, clinical lead, and external consultant on secure line. Evelyn answered from the lane. Confirmed. She looked at Dan, and for once, there was no institutional distance in her face. I stopped myself this morning because I was afraid of setting a precedent from panic, she said quietly. That pause cost time. I own that. Dan shook his head once. We all paused. She still got us there. Evelyn gave a tight nod. Then we make sure she never has to work this hard to be believed again. The 1800 debrief ran in the medical room with wet boots lined against the wall, and the smell of coffee gone bitter on a hot plate nobody remembered to turn off. Dr. Mercer appeared on screen, reviewed the extracted fragment images, and gave his assessment in plain terms. Metal composition is consistent with galvanized hardware, not biologic calcification. Migration pattern and tissue response support chronic retention with recent acute flare. Your interpretation of distress behavior is medically and behaviorally credible. He paused, then added, document this as a communication-linked intervention case. It belongs in training modules. Leo entered the recommendation into the incident file while Dan watched Luma through the window, resting in clean straw, eyes half closed, breathing steady. The room finally exhaled. 3 days passed before the floodwater dropped enough for courier transport, and at 9:06 a.m. on that third morning, Maria handed the sealed evidence canister to a licensed medical carrier at the north gate. Signature captured on paper and tablet both. At 4:40 p.m., the lab confirmed receipt and chain integrity. 2 days after that, the report returned. Zinc-coated steel fragment with surface corrosion and organic residue consistent with prolonged tissue exposure. No manufacturing mark recoverable. Dr. Rao printed the report, clipped it behind the radiographs and thermal stills, and placed the full packet in both Luma's medical chart and the policy revision binder. Nothing about that morning remained anecdotal now. By the 6th dawn after extraction, rain had finally cleared, and the barn rafters held clean autumn light instead of fog. Dan stood at 6:12 a.m. by the same piano, not for symbolism but because routine mattered, and watched Luma walk the lane without guarding. Her right forefoot landed carefully, then firmly. No recoil. Maria carried in soaked hay mash. Luma took the first mouthful immediately. Leo read the hydration trend with a grin he tried and failed to suppress. Creatinine back within her baseline band. Inflammatory markers down. Dan scratched a note on the chart and then looked up when Luma brushed the piano keys. One soft cluster, a rhythmic, exploratory. Then she moved on to the brush wall. No 11-note sequence. The staff exchanged a look that needed no translation. At the Week 4 review, the whole team gathered in the training room with the case file projected across a screen. Time-stamped logs, spectrogram matches, thermal overlays, the image of the bent fragment beside a ruler, and the revised policy text in tracked changes. Dan sat at the end of the table with his old clipboard on his lap while Evelyn read the new clause aloud. Protocol 72 now includes distress signal escalation criteria, repeated structured behavior linked to verified trauma cues, combined with objective decline metrics, may trigger early diagnostic exception prior to collapse indicators. She looked around the room. This is not less safety. This is better listening. No one argued. Then she turned to Dan. There's one more thing I didn't say that day. Her voice softened, but stayed clear. When I hesitated at 10:50, I recognized that cue pattern too. I saw it once on legal footage during intake litigation and told myself, Memory was contaminating judgment. I was wrong not to say it immediately. The admission sat heavy, then settled into the kind of silence that repairs rather than fractures. Dan nodded. You said it now. That counts. Leo added, almost under his breath. And she said it first. Even Doctor. Rao smiled at that, brief and tired and real. That afternoon, they tested the new communication framework in the enrichment barn. Tone pads mounted low on a rubber board, each linked to neutral chimes that had never been used in training or transport, each presented with full choice and no food contingency. Dan introduced the board with open palms. You can touch, you can walk away. Luma approached, inspected, pressed one pad, listened, then stepped back, and reached for the blue target disc instead. Choice made, message clear. Dan marked it in the new log template. Patient selected interaction type without coercive cue. No distress sequence observed. Gait stable. Social rumble normal. Adjacent elephants remained near rather than retreating. The strange details from that first morning had all found their place in meaning. As evening settled, Dan returned alone to the piano corner to close the day sheets. The warped wood still held a faint indentation where Luma's trunk had rested through the worst hours. The once sticking middle key had been repaired, but he left a small brass tag on the lid anyway. Voluntary touch only. No cue pairing. He heard Luma behind him, turned and watched her stop at the threshold, calm and enormous in the amber light. She did not play. She stood, breathed, and met his eyes with the same steady attention that had carried them through fear, delay, and pain. Dan set the final signed form into the chart box, latched it, and felt the weight of the day resolve into something quieter and stronger than relief. Responsibility that had finally learned the right language.